Hello, everyone. My name is Sharicz. I'm the Graduate Program Director, Instructional Design at UMass Boston. I started teaching online courses specifically 10 years ago. So I've been an online instructor now for 10 years. The process that I undertake to really design a course online it's a really conscious process. I really do give it a lot of thought initially and upfront to really think about what is the flow to this course, what are the objectives, because I always start with the objectives. What is it that I want the students to be able to know and do at the end of this particular course? And I make sure that I really organize the course that makes sense to the student. I try to put myself in the place of a student learning something for the first time regarding the content. And so I try not to make any assumptions. How I organize my materials in the course is sequential, week by week, and I have each week open at the given time. I don't have all the, 14 weeks or whatever the semester is open at one time, because I think that's too confusing for students or could be overwhelming. And that wouldn't happen in a face-to-face course when you think about it. We would, go to class every whatever it is, Monday, and, that's a brand new week. So I try to use that logic in an online course. And I do use folders because I feel like the more organized it is, the easier it is for students to find something. So I try to be very consistent in all my courses. They have the same look and feel. The welcoming environment is so important, and it really does connect to the teacher presence. And one of the things I do in my Blackboard course is the minute the course opens up in any given semester, there is a welcoming message to the course. But I also have my own personal message that I leave for the students. And in the Blackboard space, there is also an opportunity for students to introduce themselves, which they really appreciate and enjoy. And because if this is not their first course in the program, I'm finding that students are getting very creative too with how they're sharing information with each other. One student had a sign and in her picture, and she said, "Welcome, I'm happy to be here." And so that really kind of livens it up too when you have a student or so feel like they can be themselves. Because I think that's something I always strive for, is and I'm constantly thinking about my presence and how to make it as interactive as possible. And as far as introductory activities, I do have that. One of the things that I do on the very first week of any semester, and this works for me, and I'm only talking about my experience, is I do have synchronous sessions, because I feel like that live presence, so to speak, is really also comforting for students, because they get to see me. I share my background. I share the experience that I have in this field. I still do instructional design myself. And when I say that to students, they get excited about that. So I'm able to weave in actual work examples that I work on with a client or what have you. I share maybe some challenges that I have in a given workplace or things that they could come up against. And I find that really piques students' interest, because the vast majority of our students are working adults. They're either already working in the field or they will be making a career change. So the more that I can share my experiences, I feel people can relate to that, or they appreciate that. And when I do have my synchronous sessions, I find that, again, it's that environment that we're trying to create of us getting to know each other. So sometimes I'll post a question in the chat. It's not always verbal. Sometimes I like to mix up the methodologies. I might ask a question and then have the students purposely respond with 1 or 2 words in the chat. And I find they enjoy that. It mixes it up. It makes them feel a little bit more comfortable, especially if it's the first night. Not all students are willing to talk, or they might hold back a little bit. I'll use the breakout rooms. That's always beneficial. And sometimes I even come prepared with The questions, a poll, I'll do some polling. And again, students will love that because they're not expecting it. And it's usually anonymous, so I don't know who's responding with their particular answer. So just different things on the first night, but I do feel that that sets the tone for how the class is going to be. And one thing I do want to add about synchronous sessions is I do record every session. And because our synchronous sessions are not mandatory, I do encourage students, and I have it on the syllabus, the nights that we will be holding synchronous sessions so they can, mark their calendars accordingly for the semester. But I don't require them to be there. So invariably, there's usually 2 or 3 students who cannot make a session either because of a different time zone, they're still at work, or they have family responsibilities, so they can listen to the recording after. As far as pre-recording lessons, yes, I do that in every single course. I try to make my courses as accessible as possible for all learners. So in addition to having the presentation, I will have it audio recorded. One of the things I do is I have in the discussion board small groups. I have found that I used to have, when I first started teaching, like I had mentioned 10 years ago, I'd have larger groups, and I found it was kind of unwieldy, and invariably 1 or 2 students may not be participating as much. But when I break them into small groups, and what I mean by a small group is usually 4 to 5 students per group, I find it's intimate enough where they get to really know each other. And I feel, and I receive feedback that they appreciate that. They like the small groups because it's a lot more manageable for them to engage and answer questions and provide input to their colleagues, discussion posts. So I find the 4 to 5 per group is very manageable, and it really does keep them engaged. Every now and then I will mix up the groups just so they can get used to other, get to know other students in the course, and that seems to work out really well too. I also do, I did have different assignments. I mix that up as far as a methodology too, and I'll give you a specific example of that, is that a lot of times, a lot of my assignments were individually based. Each student does their own and submits it via Blackboard. But we've had clients, outside clients, come to me and asking if, and I'm thinking of one in particular, for our assessment and evaluation course, if we could evaluate the China program, the Fulbright Hays China program. And our students took that on as a group, small group. I won't go through the details of how I broke that up, but these students were so incredibly engaged with that because they were working with an actual client. And the final report that they produced was being sent to the U.S. Department of Education. So they were like, oh my goodness, this is high stakes. And the work they produced was excellent because I was overseeing everything too, and I was go-between between the client and the students. But I also invited the client into a synchronous session so they could ask the client questions directly as if they were doing a needs assessment. And so there was a lot of scaffolding going on. There was a lot of sharing of previous research to help them frame their questions. But I found that that was probably one of the best examples of when students can work on an actual project. And it was manageable. And I think that was the huge thing. So based on that experience, I had a reflection myself in that I said, why am I always doing individual assignments? Why don't I have very small group projects? So just this past semester, I broke up the students, instead of their doing an analysis of a research article, I had them all the students read the same article in the small groups, but then they were asked to critique the article. And I had 5 different groups, and there were basically 5 different critiques. Somebody would focus on this, or they'd say, well, you know what, the methodology section wasn't as well discussed or in depth as, they would have liked. But hearing each other, it just bumped up their takeaways to say, it just goes to show that if 10 different people saw something, you're going to come away with 10 or more different interpretations. And that's what happened with this research analysis, that they had different, they came away with different perspectives and different questions that they asked. So to me, I was like, aha, this was so successful. I'm definitely going to be doing that again. So I share that because I'm always learning too. I reflect on my classes at the end of each course. Not only do I reflect on it, but I look at my evaluations and I take them very seriously. And so that one example of having a small group application or group project really, really was beneficial and successful and really motivating for the students. I got so many comments on that. So that, and one thing I do want to mention is that was also, it wasn't a very lengthy group project. It was, it spanned 2 weeks. And I find, again, in my classes for our working adults, that seemed to be a good length of time. If we had a project that went on working with a group, for 5, 6, 7 weeks, that could introduce more challenges, again, because of time commitments that the students have. But this particular one seemed to work really well. The one thing that I found for myself is trying to carve out space every single day to devote to a project. So it might be okay for, also holding open office hours. I will always tell my students, please reach out to me if you have any questions, especially if they're working with an actual client or an actual project. I feel like our availability really has to be very consistent, everyday basis. And I also have to mention weekends. It's really, when you're teaching online, there really isn't the demarcation like you have in a face-to-face class. You teach a class Monday, Wednesday, or Friday from, 10 to 11:30 on campus, and there's boundaries there. One of the things I think with online, the boundaries are a little bit blurred. Not that we can't make our own boundaries, but I do find in order to facilitate or manage a project or a class, there has to be that consistency. And for me, what works is carving out that time every single day so my students know that, hey, if I write to Carolyn, 8 o'clock in the morning, I usually get a response by 8:15, that kind of thing. It just works for me. It goes back to my point about being organized. I have to be organized. I have to be on top of things. Otherwise, I stress too much about it. So one of the things about really streamlining the communication in the emails, I think the more information we can give students up front, the better it is. That will try to cut down on the questions, especially individual questions via email. And one of the ways that I do that is I have rubrics. I have a rubric in my syllabus as to what to expect for discussion postings. And I think it's pretty typical, opens on, a Sunday, and you have to post, whatever during the week for whatever points. And I find that to be very helpful. Now, what's interesting with that, because a lot of my students work, they actually said when the discussion board opens on a Sunday, that's too late for them because they work Monday through Friday, like we all do. But they asked if I could open the discussion board on a Saturday so they can work on that on a during the weekend. And I've just been doing that the last academic year, and that seems to really be helping them. So they're able to feel more relaxed because they're not being distracted by their work when it comes to be a Sunday night or a Monday or what have you. And that's been really helpful. Again, that's a new learning for me. I listened to the students and I gave them what they were asking for as far. And it's not all the students, if I have a class of 20 students, graduate students, it's not like all 20 will ask me that. It might be 2 or 3, but when I do it, everybody else chimes in and says, oh, that's perfect. Thank you for doing that. So it's always that 1 or 2 students who will speak up, and it seems to be beneficial to everybody. So I find that the more we can provide our students up front, as far as information, the more comfortable they'll feel. And hopefully it'll help them organize their routine as far as an online student. So that's a really good practice. I definitely use a variety of assessments, and I think about it in different levels too. When a student is first learning some new content knowledge, I might have them work in small groups and have them share or apply or practice what they're doing with each other. And I'll give some input, but they'll give each other some feedback. For example, if they were designing interview questions, before they actually go on an interview, and I mean interviewing stakeholders in a needs assessment process, they really need to have really honed questions, honing in on that, what they want to know. And sometimes they could come prepared with, 50 questions, which is for an hour interview. And that's like way too many questions. But if they have that practice field, if you will, with each other, they give each other that kind of feedback. And so they really appreciate that. And it's not graded. So they feel really safe and, giving each other feedback. But I've found that that is a milestone, if you will, to the final product or assessment that they'll be undertaking, which is a final written paper. But if they've already along the way have received feedback, either again from myself or from their fellow classmates on certain aspects of that final product. And I found that to be very beneficial. Regarding meaningful discussion points, the one thing I have really found, and this is whether it be face-to-face or online, when a student has a reading, whether it be articles or textbook, you really have to refer to that textbook or the readings. Otherwise, and I've been guilty of that, where I might have, like, say, 20 articles in a course, and maybe there's discussion around, or 19 of them, but there's one I don't. I still want them to know the knowledge, but they're not, tested on it in any explicit way. I do encourage them to think about maybe that one article and use it somewhere else, and maybe their final paper or what have you. But I've found that if you don't, explicitly have a question or questions around the readings, then that can be very demotivating for a student. So I will, really think about what's the question I really want to hone in on here. What would really tie maybe this article to something else, or tie this article or the knowledge there with something that I, is part of my course objective. So I really give that a lot of thought. They are graded. What it is, it's on a point system. So if students post between, like, the first 2 days, it's a sliding scale. It's 3 points, which is the maximum for any given week. And then it goes down. So at the end of the week, if somebody hasn't posted yet, their initial posting, they might get 1 point or 0.5 points. But they know it up front because, again, it's in the rubric, in the syllabus. But I do find that is motivating for a lot of students to know that it's already there and what to expect in any given week. It's the same. Again, it's the consistency. But yes, I do grade the discussion